A powerful woman walks into a police station, treated like an outsider, mocked, dismissed, even punched by a veteran cop. But when her true identity is revealed, his career is shattered and the entire department is turned upside down. What happens next will leave you speechless. The air inside the Atlanta Police Department was thick with routine. Officers huddled around the front desk, exchanging jokes and sipping coffee as the morning unfolded. To them, it was just another day. Unbeknownst to them, everything was about to change. Madison Carter stood just outside the glass doors, her reflection staring back at her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of why she was here. Dressed in dark jeans, a simple shirt, and a well-fitted blazer, she looked nothing like the figure of authority she truly was. There was no badge displayed on her chest, no uniform to signify rank, only the quiet confidence of someone who had endured and overcome far more than they could ever imagine. As she pushed the door open, her entrance went unnoticed. Officers didn't look up, too engrossed in their conversations. Madison moved through the room silently, her eyes catching details like a seasoned detective. A young black man sat hunched in the corner, eyes glued to the floor, his hands clasped tightly as if holding on to his last shred of hope. No one had approached him. No one seemed to care that he had been waiting far too long. Madison's instincts whispered to her. This wasn't just oversight, it was deliberate. The officer's indifference, the dismissive glances, the unspoken rule that some people simply didn't deserve attention. She clenched her jaw, fighting the surge of anger. She wasn't here to unleash fury. She was here to understand, to witness. She made her way to the front desk, where a young officer was more engaged with his phone than with his duties. Madison cleared her throat softly. The officer, without lifting his gaze, muttered, "Yeah? What do you want?" His tone was neither polite nor professional. Madison noted the casual disregard, a subtle reminder that, to him, she was no one important. "I'm here to see HR," she said evenly. He barely glanced at her. "Upstairs," he replied, then resumed scrolling through his screen. A voice from the side caught her attention, a gruff, commanding tone that made the other officers instinctively straighten. Lieutenant Patrick Coleman, tall, muscular, and exuding authority, he made it clear that he wasn't one to be crossed. Coleman's eyes narrowed as he spotted Madison. He looked her up and down, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice laced with disdain. "Why are you just standing around here?" Madison didn't flinch. "I'm here to complete some paperwork," she replied. Coleman scoffed, stepping closer. "Paperwork? Are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't social services." The remark stung, not because of the words, but because of the assumption. Madison kept her expression neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. "Just tell me where HR is," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. Coleman chuckled darkly. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands? This isn't your playground, lady. People like you don't belong here." Something in his tone shifted, a sharp, ugly edge that made Madison's stomach twist. She could sense the others watching, some curious, some amused. She could feel the room's energy shifting, the silent acknowledgement that this was how things were, and no one dared to challenge it. Madison didn't move, didn't retreat. "I just need directions to HR," she repeated. Coleman's eyes flashed with annoyance. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but we don't have time for this nonsense. You want help? Go down to the community center. They're better equipped for your kind." Madison's fists tightened at her sides. Years of training taught her to control her reactions, but it didn't make the insult sting any less. Before she could respond, Coleman took a step closer, his chest practically brushing against her shoulder. His hand shot out, gripping her arm roughly. "You're wasting my time," he growled. "Get out." Madison yanked her arm free, her movement swift and precise. Coleman's face flashed with surprise, but it lasted only a second before his pride kicked in. His fist flew through the air, a powerful, unrestrained punch that connected with her cheek. The force sent her stumbling back, her shoulder hitting the edge of a nearby desk. Silence fell like a shroud over the room. A few officers chuckled under their breath, while others looked on with a mix of shock and amusement. To them, it was nothing unusual, just a lesson being taught. Madison straightened slowly, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Coleman's smirk grew as he saw her struggle to regain her balance. "Next time, know your place," he sneered. The door to the hallway opened, and Captain James Rowe entered, his steps faltering as he took in the scene. His face drained of color as his eyes landed on Madison. "Chief Carter," he blurted, his voice almost a whisper. The room froze. Coleman's confident stance crumbled as confusion flickered across his face. "Chief?" he stammered. Madison wiped the blood from her lip, her eyes never leaving Coleman's face. "Yes, Chief Madison Carter," she confirmed, her voice firm and clear. "And you, Lieutenant Coleman, just assaulted your superior officer." The weight of her words crushed the room's atmosphere. Coleman's face paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Captain Rowe didn't waste a second. He ordered the nearest officers to cuff Coleman, whose bravado had disintegrated into frantic denial. I didn't know," Coleman sputtered, his arrogance melting into panic. Madison didn't respond. She merely stood tall, her presence commanding respect even in her wounded state. The officers who had laughed earlier now avoided her gaze, shame creeping into their expressions. As Coleman was dragged away, still shouting incoherent excuses, Madison took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could feel the shift, the realization dawning on everyone present that the power dynamics had just changed irrevocably. For years, Coleman had ruled through intimidation and prejudice, but with a single blow, he had struck down his own career. Madison wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the new face of justice in Atlanta, and from that moment on, things would never be the same. The fallout from the incident spread through the Atlanta Police Department like wildfire. News of Lieutenant Patrick Coleman's arrest had shaken the core of the force, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the ranks. Those who had stood by watching, some even laughing, now found themselves consumed by guilt and fear. A once untouchable figure, Coleman had been publicly humiliated, and by none other than the new chief herself. Chief Madison Carter knew that the arrest was only the beginning. The real fight lay ahead. As she settled into her new office, bare, minimalist, with a single frame certificate of her decades of service on the wall, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the challenge that loomed before her. It wasn't just about punishing one man for his actions. It was about dismantling a system that had been cultivated and preserved for decades, thriving on discrimination, fear, and silence. Madison had spent 20 years in law enforcement, working her way up from patrol officer to detective, and finally, to the position she held now. Along the way, she had seen enough to know that corruption rarely existed in isolation. It took root, fed by complacency and loyalty to a status quo that benefited the powerful and crushed the vulnerable. Here, in Atlanta PD, those roots ran deep. Coleman was not the disease, merely a symptom, and as long as the culture remained unchanged, another Coleman would rise to take his place. The department itself had always been a complex machine, one where white officers moved upward with ease, while black officers found themselves stuck at the bottom, regardless of their achievements or dedication. Coleman's arrest had stirred something in the younger officers, who had watched from the sidelines as the long-standing power dynamics had played out. They saw an opportunity for change, but fear kept them tethered to the old way. For years, their mentors and senior officers had drilled one lesson into them: loyalty above all else. But loyalty to what? To whom? Madison had never been one to blindly follow. She knew that change would require breaking down not just the rules but the unwritten codes that had governed the department for generations. Those who opposed her, especially Coleman's allies, would frame her mission as a threat to tradition, an attack on the very foundation of the force. They would whisper behind closed doors, rally against her in the locker rooms, and undermine her at every turn. She was prepared for that. What she wasn't prepared for was the subtle resistance from those who believed they were doing the right thing by preserving the old ways. Captain James Rowe, head of HR, was one of those men. Although he had been quick to act when Coleman assaulted Madison, his unease was palpable. Rowe was a veteran, proud of the department's legacy, and while he didn't condone violence or overt discrimination, he had grown accustomed to a hierarchy where men like Coleman thrived. To him, Madison represented a shift that was too sudden, too forceful. "Chief," Rowe had said, entering her office one morning with a hesitant knock. "About Coleman's situation, some of the guys are saying it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he didn't know who you were. You know how things get misinterpreted." Madison fixed her gaze on him, unblinking. "Captain Rowe, does it matter if he knew who I was? Would it have been acceptable for him to assault any black woman who walked through those doors?" Rowe hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "No, of course not. But you have to understand, he's been with us a long time. He's respected." "Respected?" Madison leaned forward, her voice low and firm. "Respected for what, exactly? For intimidating his subordinates? For fostering a culture where racial bias is excused? If that's the kind of respect this department honors, then we have a bigger problem than I thought." The captain seemed to shrink under her stare. "I just mean, it's complicated. People are on edge. They don't know where they stand anymore." "That's because this ground they stood on wasn't solid to begin with," Madison replied, standing up. "I'm not here to maintain a broken system. I'm here to fix it, and that means facing uncomfortable truths. If anyone can't handle that, they're free to leave." Rowe left, a hint of uncertainty clouding his expression. Madison knew that men like him were more dangerous than the openly hostile ones because they perpetuated the illusion that things were fine as long as they remained unchanged. Over the next few days, Madison held private meetings with officers who had filed complaints against Coleman and his associates. Some were hesitant to speak, fearing retaliation, but as word spread that the new chief was taking a stand, more came forward. Stories of racial profiling, discriminatory remarks, and outright hostility began to surface. Madison listened intently, documenting each account. She needed more than just words. She needed proof. A task force was formed to review internal affairs reports that had been conveniently buried or dismissed. Madison knew that opening old wounds would be painful, not just for the victims but for those who had looked the other way. One evening, while sifting through case files, she found a pattern. Coleman had been reported multiple times for misconduct, but his cases were routinely closed with minimal investigation, signed off by familiar names, those who had long been part of his inner circle. She couldn't do this alone. She needed allies, officers who believed in justice more than tradition. To that end, she began speaking to the younger officers, those still shaping their identities as law enforcers. She challenged them to think critically about their roles, to consider who they served and why. Madison wasn't naive. She knew she couldn't change minds overnight. But with each conversation, with each story that surfaced, the foundation that Coleman and his ilk had built began to crack. The officers who had once admired him now questioned his legacy. The older ones who clung to the past watched, wary of a change they didn't fully understand. Outside the department, the community began to take notice. News of the internal investigation spread, and activists demanded transparency. Madison met with local leaders, reassuring them that justice would prevail, not just in Coleman's case, but in the entire culture of the department. There were threats, of course. Anonymous notes slipped under her door, warning her to back off. Whispered rumors that she was destroying the department from within. Madison didn't flinch. She had fought too hard to back down now. Her resolve only strengthened. It wasn't just about punishing one man. It was about tearing down a system that allowed men like him to thrive. And as Madison looked at the city from her office window, she knew that the battle was just beginning. But for the first time, the Atlanta PD was starting to feel the tremors of real change. The tension within the Atlanta Police Department was palpable in the days following Lieutenant Patrick Coleman's arrest. Word of his public humiliation at the hands of Chief Madison Carter spread like wildfire, both within the department and throughout the community. Opinions were divided. Some saw it as a long overdue reckoning, while others whispered that Madison had overstepped, that she was destabilizing the force by punishing a respected veteran. Madison knew these murmurs existed, but she couldn't afford to let them deter her. The real challenge was just beginning. Madison had faced resistance throughout her career, covert, systemic, and at times brutally overt. Yet this felt different. She wasn't just fighting one man's arrogance. She was fighting a culture, a mentality ingrained so deeply that even those who knew better felt powerless to challenge it. She sat in her sparse office late one evening sorting through a stack of case files that dated back years. The names of officers who had received complaints of misconduct seemed to form a familiar pattern. It wasn't just Coleman. There were others, many others, whose actions had been quietly overlooked. As she worked, Madison couldn't help but think about how Coleman had come to represent something larger than himself. He was not merely one problematic officer. He was a symbol of a culture that protected its own at any cost. A culture that had allowed men like him to thrive while officers of color, and women in particular, were kept at the margins, discouraged, discredited, and disrespected. Madison knew she needed allies, and she found herself reflecting on the officers who had approached her in the days since the incident. Some, like Officer Davis, had expressed quiet support. Davis was young, fresh out of the academy, and still held on to the idealistic belief that police work was about justice, not power. He had approached Madison cautiously, almost embarrassed to be seen talking to her. Chief Carter, he had said one morning, glancing around to make sure they were alone. I just, I wanted to say thank you for what you did. A lot of us, well, some of us, we've seen things Coleman did, but nobody dared say anything. We thought it wouldn't matter. Madison had given him a reassuring smile, knowing the courage it took to speak up, even now. It does matter, she had replied. And you coming forward matters too. We're going to change this place, but it's going to take more than just me. It takes all of us. She had asked him to document what he had witnessed, promising anonymity if he preferred. Davis had nodded, looking both hopeful and terrified. Madison knew that his fear was not just of reprisal from Coleman's friends, but of breaking the unspoken code: never turn on your fellow officers. But as more stories trickled in, it became evident that Coleman's behavior wasn't an isolated issue. Madison's team compiled a comprehensive report detailing incidents of misconduct, from verbal abuse and intimidation to racially biased arrests and questionable use of force. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered a systematic effort to bury complaints, falsify reports, and silence dissent. Coleman had friends in high places, supervisors who signed off on his reports without a second glance, fellow officers who conveniently forgot incidents when questioned, and even some in internal affairs who closed cases with suspicious speed. One name that kept surfacing was Captain James Rowe. Madison had suspected as much. Rowe had been Coleman's mentor when he first joined the force. Back then, Coleman had been just another rookie with something to prove. Rowe had shaped him, instilling the importance of loyalty and strength, but somewhere along the way, that strength had turned into unchecked power. Madison knew confronting Rowe directly would be risky. If he felt cornered, he might retaliate or rally other senior officers against her. She needed evidence that would make it impossible for him to deny his involvement. One evening, after most officers had left for the day, Madison found herself in the department archives. Davis had tipped her off that old records, those not yet digitized, were often neglected but still accessible if one knew where to look. She pulled out file after file, looking for anything that linked Rowe directly to Coleman's misconduct. It was tedious work, and as the hours passed, doubt began to creep in. Was she really going to find a smoking gun, or was this just another dead end? Then she found it, a series of disciplinary reports from years earlier, documenting complaints against Coleman for racial profiling. Each report had Rowe's signature at the bottom, marked "No action warranted." Madison's heart pounded. This wasn't just negligence, it was a cover-up. Rowe had protected Coleman from repercussions, allowing him to continue unchecked. The next morning, Madison called a meeting with the investigative team. She laid out the documents on the table, watching their reactions: shock, anger, and, for some, a weary sense of vindication. They had known something was wrong, but seeing it laid out so plainly was another matter. "We're not just dealing with one bad cop," Madison said, her voice steady but intense. "We're dealing with a network of protection and silence. This doesn't end with Coleman. We're going to follow this trail as far as it goes." One of the senior detectives, a seasoned woman named Linda Morrison, nodded in agreement. "If Rowe's involved, it means this runs deeper than we thought. We'll have to be careful. He's got years of loyalty built up around him." Madison knew Morrison was right. If they moved too aggressively, they risked not just resistance but sabotage. Still, they couldn't ignore the evidence. As the task force continued to gather testimonies and cross-reference cases, Madison made a strategic decision. They would involve the city's oversight committee. By bringing in an external body, she would minimize the risk of internal tampering. When the news broke that Captain Rowe was under investigation, the department seemed to hold its breath. Rowe, a figure once seen as untouchable, became a symbol of everything wrong with the old guard. Some officers felt betrayed. How could a man they had admired be part of something so corrupt? Others felt relieved, seeing this as a chance to reclaim their integrity. But Rowe didn't go quietly. He filed a formal grievance, accusing Madison of targeting him unfairly and undermining the department's cohesion. He appeared on local news, painting himself as a victim of a political agenda. Madison remained composed, refusing to engage publicly. She knew the truth would speak for itself. Behind closed doors, however, the pressure was mounting. Rowe's allies began to openly question Madison's motives. Officers who had initially supported her started to distance themselves, worried about the fallout. Some whispered that Madison was trying to dismantle the department piece by piece, that she wasn't one of them. Then, unexpectedly, support came from an unlikely source, a group of retired officers who had faced similar battles during their time. They publicly endorsed Madison's investigation, reminding the city that rooting out corruption wasn't an attack on law enforcement, but a necessary step to rebuild trust. Their voices gave Madison the boost she needed, reminding the community and the department that justice was not about loyalty to individuals, but to the ideals they were sworn to uphold. It wasn't just the older generation speaking out. Young officers, inspired by Madison's determination, began to step forward, not just with testimonies but with ideas: how to reform the system, how to make the department more accountable. Madison listened to each one, encouraged by their passion and willingness to envision a better future. Change was never easy, and it would come at a cost. But for the first time, it felt possible. As more truth surfaced, Atlanta watched closely. The department's darkest secrets were being exposed, and Madison knew that once the veil was lifted, there would be no going back. As the truth about Lieutenant Patrick Coleman and Captain James Rowe continued to unravel, Chief Madison Carter knew that exposing the corruption was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in transforming the deeply ingrained culture within the Atlanta Police Department. It wasn't just about holding individual officers accountable, it was about dismantling a system that had thrived on discrimination, intimidation, and silence for decades. Madison understood that change would not come through force alone. She needed to inspire a transformation from within, guiding those who wanted to do right while confronting those who resisted. She started by calling a departmental meeting, one that no one could avoid. The room was tense as officers shuffled in, uncertain of what to expect. Some looked defiant, others apprehensive, but most just seemed exhausted, caught between loyalty to old friends and the uncomfortable realization that things were about to change. Standing at the front, Madison took a moment to look at the faces before her. She knew that some of them still blamed her for Coleman's downfall, for exposing Rose's complicity. To them, she was a disruptor, someone who didn't understand the brotherhood they had built over years of service. But she couldn't allow their discomfort to dictate the future. Taking a deep breath, she began. Every single one of you took an oath to protect and serve, Madison said, her voice steady. Not just to protect your partners or those who wear the same uniform, but to protect every member of this community, regardless of their skin color, background, or beliefs. That oath doesn't bend based on convenience or personal bias. It stands firm because it's rooted in justice. A few officers exchanged glances, unsure of where she was heading. Madison continued, I know some of you are angry, angry at me, angry at the changes happening around you. You believe that I'm here to destroy what you've built. That couldn't be further from the truth. I'm here to rebuild trust, not just between the department and the community, but among ourselves. But to do that, we have to be honest. We have to confront the fact that we've let our standards slip, that we've allowed prejudice to dictate how we enforce the law. Her words hung heavy in the air. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, while others remained stone-faced. Madison pressed on. This is not an attack on your loyalty to each other. Brotherhood is important, but true loyalty isn't about protecting wrongdoers. It's about holding each other to the highest standard because that's how we become stronger. That's how we serve honorably. One officer, Detective Linda Morrison, raised her hand. Chief, with all due respect, some of us feel blindsided. We've worked with Coleman for years. It's hard to reconcile the man we knew with the man being portrayed now. Madison nodded, appreciating the honesty. I understand. Change is hard when it challenges your perception of someone you respected. But the reality is that respect doesn't exempt anyone from accountability. I've reviewed the files, hundreds of complaints that were ignored or dismissed. Many of those complaints came from citizens who were unfairly treated. That's not brotherhood, that's negligence. And it hurts not just the victims, but the integrity of this entire department. Another voice spoke up, this time from Officer Davis, who had privately supported her before. What about those of us who didn't know? Are we being blamed too? Madison shook her head. No, Davis, you're not being blamed. But ignorance doesn't absolve us from responsibility either. What matters now is how we move forward. We have to acknowledge the problem, hold those accountable who violated their duties, and rebuild trust with this community. She paused, letting her words sink in. That's why I'm implementing new protocols. From today onward, every complaint will be reviewed by an independent committee to ensure transparency. We'll conduct regular ethics training, focusing on de-escalation and community engagement. I'm also establishing an anonymous reporting system for officers who witness misconduct. No more turning a blind eye because you're afraid of retribution. There was a low murmur among the officers. Some looked relieved, others wary. Madison knew it wouldn't be easy. Years of conditioned loyalty to figures like Coleman couldn't be undone in one meeting. After the assembly, Madison sought out Detective Morrison privately. Morrison was respected, level-headed, and someone who could sway the more reluctant officers. Linda, Madison began, I need your help. Officers look up to you. If you stand with me on this, they'll listen. But I also need you to be honest with them. Share your own struggles with accepting what happened. Morrison nodded, her expression thoughtful. I get it. It's just hard to change your mindset after years of seeing things one way. But I know you're right. We can't ignore what happened, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Madison placed a hand on her shoulder. It's okay to feel conflicted. That's part of growth. Just don't let that discomfort keep you from doing what's right. In the days that followed, Madison held smaller group meetings, encouraging open dialogue. She listened as officers vented their frustrations, voiced their doubts, and shared their fears. Some revealed that they'd felt uneasy about Coleman's behavior for years, but didn't know how to speak up without facing backlash. Others admitted that they'd followed his lead simply because it was easier than questioning a superior. As the discussions continued, something unexpected began to happen. Officers who had once staunchly defended Coleman started to see his actions in a new light. The realization that they had been complicit, even passively, was unsettling. But Madison didn't shame them. Instead, she focused on accountability, making it clear that while past mistakes couldn't be undone, the future was theirs to shape. One evening, Davis approached Madison again, this time with a group of younger officers. Chief, we've been talking, he said, nervously glancing at his colleagues. We want to help. We're tired of feeling like the good guys and bad guys wear the same uniform. Tell us what we can do to make things right. Madison couldn't help but smile, a genuine, hopeful smile. You can start by being the officers this community deserves. Treat every citizen with respect, regardless of their background. Speak up when you see something wrong. And most importantly, hold each other accountable. Change doesn't happen because one person demands it. It happens when a community of good people decides enough is enough. With their support growing, Madison knew the tide was turning. The resistance from senior officers was still there, but it was quieter, less emboldened by numbers. The community noticed the shift too. When the department hosted a public forum to address past injustices, people came not just to criticize, but to cautiously hope. Madison spoke openly, acknowledging the department's failures and pledging transparency moving forward. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense that progress wasn't just a distant promise, but a tangible goal. The chains of injustice that had bound the department for years were slowly being broken, not through force, but through honesty, collaboration, and a shared commitment to doing better. Madison knew the journey was far from over. There would still be resistance, mistakes, and setbacks. But as she watched her officers actively engaging with the community, listening, learning, and slowly earning back trust, she knew that they had taken the first crucial steps toward real change. The Atlanta Police Department had changed in ways that many thought impossible just a few months prior. The atmosphere, once heavy with complacency and tradition, now hummed with a cautious but growing sense of renewal. Chief Madison Carter could feel it each time she walked through the precinct. The guarded looks had softened. Officers who had once whispered behind her back now greeted her with a nod of respect, though some still hesitated to fully embrace the changes. Madison didn't expect perfection overnight. Real transformation, she knew, was messy and slow. But for the first time, it felt tangible. The community had taken notice as well. After years of strained relationships and mistrust, people were cautiously optimistic. Madison had made it a point to be visible, not just as a figurehead, but as a leader willing to listen. She attended community meetings, answered hard questions, and admitted to the department's past failings without making excuses. It was risky to be so honest, but it was the only way forward. Trust wouldn't be given freely. It had to be earned day by day, interaction by interaction. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Atlanta skyline, Madison sat at her desk poring over reports. The door to her office creaked open, and Linda Morrison stepped in, holding a folder marked with the city's emblem. Chief, Morrison began, a hesitant smile breaking through her usually stoic demeanor. We've got the final report from the Oversight Committee. They've completed their review of the department's practices, and they wanted to discuss their recommendations with you personally. Madison gestured for her to sit, bracing herself for what she knew would be a critical assessment. As Morrison settled into the chair, she couldn't help but notice the lines of exhaustion etched into Madison's face. Leading change was not just a professional burden, but a deeply personal one. They found substantial evidence supporting the allegations against Coleman and Rowe, Morrison continued. But more than that, they identified systemic issues, bias in promotion practices, discrepancies in how complaints are handled, and a lack of accountability when it comes to officer misconduct. Madison nodded. None of this was news to her, but hearing it confirmed by an independent body gave her mission new legitimacy. What are their recommendations? She asked. Morrison opened the folder. They want us to establish a permanent community advisory board, one with real oversight, not just symbolic participation. They're also recommending mandatory de-escalation training and periodic psychological evaluations for officers in high-stress roles. And, of course, a comprehensive review of recruitment practices to address the lack of diversity. Madison leaned back, absorbing the weight of the changes. It was ambitious, more so than even she had anticipated. Implementing these recommendations would undoubtedly spark backlash from some quarters, especially among the older officers who saw tradition as their shield against scrutiny. Later that week, Madison called a press conference. It was held on the steps of the department, where just months earlier, angry protesters had gathered demanding justice. Now, the crowd that assembled was quieter, more contemplative. Madison took her place at the podium, flanked by community leaders who had been instrumental in guiding the department through the crisis. "We've faced difficult truths," Madison began, her voice steady and resolute. "We've confronted the fact that our department failed the community. We allowed a culture to take root that did not reflect the values we swore to uphold. But today, I'm here to tell you that we are committed to change, real change. We will be more transparent, more accountable, and more just." There was a pause as her words sank in. Some in the crowd nodded in quiet approval, while others remained skeptical. Madison didn't blame them. Too often, promises had been made and broken. She wasn't interested in platitudes. She wanted results. "We will be forming a community advisory board to ensure that your voices are heard, not just today, but as a permanent part of how we operate. We are overhauling our training practices to focus on de-escalation, community engagement, and fair treatment for all. And most importantly, we are committing to holding ourselves accountable. No officer is above the law, not yesterday, not today, not ever." A few hands clapped, hesitant at first, then gaining momentum. Madison didn't smile or celebrate. There was too much work left to do. She could see a few familiar faces in the crowd, people who had spoken out against police violence, who had lost loved ones to the very system she was now fighting to change. She caught the eye of a young woman holding a photo of her brother, who had been killed in an officer-involved shooting years prior. The woman didn't cheer. She just stared, unflinching, waiting to see if this time would be any different. Back at the precinct, the changes began taking shape. Madison formed specialized committees to implement the Oversight Committee's recommendations. Officers resistant to the new policies found themselves faced with a choice: adapt or leave. Some took early retirement, grumbling about the loss of the old ways. Others, to Madison's surprise, began to embrace the reforms, even those who had initially opposed her. The realization that the community was watching, that the old culture was being dismantled, forced many to rethink their loyalties. Madison didn't shy away from hard conversations. She met with officers one-on-one, especially those who felt alienated or confused. Some of them, like Officer Davis, had already begun to see the value in rebuilding trust, but others, like Sergeant Howard, clung to the belief that the changes undermined authority. Madison listened without judgment, but she didn't compromise on her principles. Howard, she said during one meeting, authority isn't about fear, it's about respect. And respect is something we've been demanding without earning. We can't just keep doing what we've always done because it's comfortable. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. He didn't respond immediately, his jaw tight with suppressed frustration. I just don't know how to do my job if I have to second guess every move. That's not what this is about, Madison countered gently. It's about making decisions that reflect our integrity, not our power. We can still protect this city, but we have to do it the right way. The words seemed to resonate, and for the first time, Howard looked less defensive, more contemplative. The ripple effects of reform extended beyond the precinct. Madison's efforts drew attention from other cities grappling with similar issues. She received calls from police chiefs in neighboring states as asking for advice on how to implement their own changes. At first, it felt surreal. Just months ago, she had been the newcomer, scrutinized and doubted. Now, she was seen as a leader in progressive policing. One evening, after a long day, Madison stood on the steps of the precinct, looking out at the city. Linda Morrison joined her, a quiet solidarity between them. You did it, you know, Morrison said, breaking the silence. You didn't just change the department, you changed how we see ourselves. Madison looked at her colleague, grateful for the support that had made all the difference. We did it, she corrected. And we're just getting started. The city of Atlanta was far from perfect, but it was healing. The community was no longer seen as an enemy to be controlled, but as a partner to be respected. As Madison walked back inside, she knew the journey was far from over, but she also knew they had taken the most important step, admitting that change was necessary and having the courage to make it happen. The story of Chief Madison Carter is not just a narrative of justice prevailing over corruption. It is a profound journey of courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of integrity in the face of deeply entrenched prejudice. From the moment Madison Carter walked into the Atlanta Police Department, disguised as an ordinary citizen, she set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundation of the institution. The shocking assault by Lieutenant Patrick Coleman, a man who believed his position of power made him untouchable, was a turning point, not just for Madison, but for the entire department. When the truth of her identity was revealed, the realization struck hard, not only for Coleman, but for every officer present. It was a moment that stripped away the illusion of invulnerability that many officers, especially those in positions of unchecked power, had clung to for years. Madison's unwavering resolve to confront the abuse of authority marked the beginning of a transformative journey for the Atlanta PD. Madison's response to the incident was both calculated and principled. She did not respond with vengeance or aggression. Instead, she maintained her composure, demonstrating the very qualities that had earned her the role of chief: strength, fairness, and a commitment to justice. Her decision to arrest Coleman on the spot sent a clear message. No one, regardless of rank or tenure, was above the law. This act of accountability was the first step in dismantling the culture of silence that had protected wrongdoers within the force for decades. What makes Madison's story remarkable is not just her position of power, but how she chose to use it. She could have easily turned a blind eye, maintaining a semblance of harmony by ignoring the problem. Instead, she faced it head on, knowing the personal and professional risks involved. She understood that real change required more than just exposing the wrongdoing of one man. It required confronting an entire system that had allowed such behavior to thrive. After Coleman's arrest, Madison did not stop. She initiated a comprehensive internal investigation, determined to trace the roots of the corruption and bias that had plagued the department for so long. She knew that Coleman was not an isolated case. but rather a symptom of a much larger problem. The investigation revealed a network of complicity where misconduct was routinely overlooked and complaints were dismissed without proper review. At the heart of this network was Captain James Rowe, a man who had shielded Coleman for years, enabling his behavior through silence and tacit approval. Madison's strategy was to not only expose the individuals involved, but to address the systemic flaws that had fostered this toxic environment. She recognized that many officers were hesitant to speak out, not necessarily out of loyalty to Coleman, but out of fear of breaking the unspoken code of brotherhood. Understanding this, Madison focused on creating a safe space for truth-telling. She encouraged officers like Davis, a young and idealistic cop, to share their experiences without fear of retribution. By giving them a voice, she began to break down the walls of silence that had protected wrongdoers for so long. One of the most profound moments in Madison's journey was her decision to hold a series of open forums, inviting not only officers but also community members to discuss their experiences and grievances with the department. It was a bold move, one that exposed the raw, often painful truths of how policing had failed the community. Some stories were heartbreaking, families torn apart by violence, lives forever changed by unjust treatment. Madison did not shy away from these testimonies. She embraced them as the catalyst for change. The reform process was not without resistance. Madison faced backlash from officers who felt betrayed, especially those who had long admired Coleman and Rowe. They viewed her efforts as an attack on tradition, a betrayal of the tight-knit brotherhood that had been cultivated over decades. Yet, Madison remained steadfast. She understood that loyalty could not be synonymous with enabling misconduct. Loyalty had to mean holding each other accountable, striving to uphold the values they had sworn to protect. Through persistent dialogue and transparent leadership, Madison gradually won over even the skeptics. She did not position herself as an outsider enforcing change, but as one of them, someone who had risen through the ranks, faced discrimination herself, and still chose to stand for what was right. Her willingness to listen, to acknowledge the fears of those resistant to change, made her more than just a leader. It made her a symbol of hope. As reforms took root, the Atlanta PD began to shift. Officers who once remained silent began to speak out against practices they had once felt powerless to change. The introduction of the Community Advisory Board marked a turning point. No longer would the department operate behind closed doors, shielded from public scrutiny. By actively involving the community, Madison demonstrated that policing was not just about enforcement, but about partnership. Madison's story resonates because it reflects a fundamental truth about leadership. Real leaders do not shy away from difficult conversations. They confront challenges with empathy and resolve, understanding that meaningful change requires sacrifice. Madison's journey was not just about cleaning up a corrupt department. It was about redefining what it meant to serve and protect. The lessons from Madison Carter's story are deeply relevant to our lives today. In any system, whether it be a workplace, community, or institution, there will always be resistance to change. People naturally cling to what is familiar, even if it is flawed, because change threatens their sense of stability. Yet, as Madison demonstrated, change is not only necessary but vital when the system itself is harming those it is meant to protect. We must learn to hold ourselves and those around us accountable. Whether we are in positions of power or not, we have a responsibility to speak out against injustice. Silence only serves to perpetuate harm. It takes courage to be the one who challenges the norm, to risk isolation for the sake of integrity. But as Madison's journey shows, the impact of standing up for what is right can resonate far beyond the immediate moment. It can transform a community, inspire others, and create a legacy built on respect and honor. In our own lives, we should strive to embody the same principles Madison upheld: fairness, transparency, and the courage to confront wrongdoing, even when it is uncomfortable. By doing so, we not only foster trust, but pave the way for others to do the same. Change does not happen in a vacuum. It requires collective effort, a willingness to confront our own biases, and the determination to build a more just environment for everyone. Madison Carter's story is a powerful reminder that justice is not a passive ideal, but an active pursuit. It challenges us to reflect on our own actions and to ask ourselves, are we upholding the principles we claim to value? Are we willing to challenge injustice, even when it comes from within? The path is never easy, but it is one worth taking, for the sake of those who cannot fight for themselves. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about justice and leadership, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that challenges perspectives and highlights stories of courage and change. Don't miss out on more impactful stories. Hit the subscribe button and join our community today. Together, we can continue to learn, grow, and make a difference. Thank you for watching.